Hi, my name is Shaun. I am Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. I've spent the last 40 years really trying to understand how China works. I first went there in 1984. I saw Wham perform live at the Workers' Stadium in 1985, but that's another story for another day. You will notice that I didn't say Department of Economics, and I am not an economist. I very much focus on politics and international relations, but I have a keen interest on the political underpinnings of the economy, if we can put it that way. And that's really what I'm going to focus on in this short lecture today. I have to say that I was pleased to be asked to do this and said yes rapidly, and then almost immediately had second thoughts. And that's partly because I haven't recorded a lecture since the end of the pandemic. I started off with the pandemic being terrible at doing these recorded presentations. Got better, I think, I hope. You'll have to ask my students at Warwick, but I think I got better. But obviously for the last couple of years or so, we've been back in the classroom, and some of those skills that we learned during the pandemic have been forgotten. So let's see how this goes. I hope it's not too bad. But the second reason that I had some trepidation was that it's such a big area. It's very complex, it's very dynamic, it's changing as well. And so I was a bit worried that I couldn't do the topic justice in 20 minutes. I've decided to focus in on just a few key issues, and they really relate to the way that the CCP tries to manage the economy to achieve its goals and objectives. And hopefully in 20 minutes or so, we'll have got some way to explaining what those objectives are and the mechanisms that the party state uses to try and control this strange hybrid of state and market economy that the Chinese system has become. Very quickly, before I forget, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. The first is that to get the text formatted correctly, you'll find that I appear in different parts of the screen as I move from slide to slide. I hope that's not too disruptive. But I guess one of the benefits of recording a lecture is that you can do it at your pace, so you can pause. That's certainly one place where you might want to pause, and even stop and rewind. And there is a rather complex slide towards the end that you might want to do exactly that with. Go back over and have a look. And the second thing to say is that a lot of my thinking is described in more detail in this book, in particular chapter 2. So if you've got access to that and find anything that I'm going to say in a few moments interesting, then that's the place to go to. I'll also show you at the end of the lecture a couple of other places where you can find more papers, all of them openly available. So with that, I think we get on with the lecture proper. Now, one of the reasons it's so tricky to talk about the Chinese economy in simple and simplistic terms is the size and scale and diversity of the country. Now, we don't have time to go into any real detail about the nature of local governments in China or paint a rich picture of the full scale of diversity. So just a few slides to give a taster, really, an indication of these differences. I mean, here you can see population size of China's provinces, autonomous regions, and major cities are often lumped together and called provincial level units. Huge differences from nearly 130 million down to just under 4. Probably more important for us in this lecture, here we see the provincial level difference in local GDPs in 2022. And pretty much any economic statistic you were looking for, you would find similar levels of divergence across China's provinces. Here are just 2 examples showing the different ways in which Chinese provinces and regions are integrated into the global economy. One chart showing exports by provinces. Now, I'm a little wary about using figures from during the pandemic because obviously these weren't normal times, but actually if you took any year or even a span of years, you'd see the coastal provinces absolutely dominating when it comes to their share of Chinese exports. And then when we see FDI inflows into China, this time from before the pandemic, again we see a very heavy emphasis on China's eastern coastal provinces. So massively different numbers there depending on what part of the country you're looking at. I remember sitting down with a Chinese economist a few years ago, and he explained to me how different provinces had different types of economic models, ranging from a very strong hand for the state, largely, but not only, where heavy industry dominates, to ones where the private sector was really the main source of economic activity. And on a daily basis, local governments are extremely important for the way that the economy functions. And I don't mean the provincial governments, as we saw there. Some of these are huge, over 100 million. I mean the really local governments, the townships, the counties, the prefectures. It's these governments that have a big say over what type of economic activity is taking place. They give out licenses and permits and permissions. If you don't have a good relationship with the local government, it become quite difficult to actually get anything done. And this is why this Chinese scholar at Tsinghua University has referred to the Chinese economy as a preferential model. And what he means is that if you build up this good relationship with the local government, then you can get access to money, you can get contracts, you can perhaps get a good deal with the tax collectors, and it makes life much easier for you. It might not be that the local government directly owns and controls all the enterprises in an area, but they can have a significant influence over who can do what in any given locality. One of the things that local governments can do, and indeed many of them do, is protect their own local producers from competition from other parts of China. And here we see Xi Jinping at the Party Congress in 2022 talking about the need to break local protectionism. He's not the first Chinese leader to identify this as a problem, to think in terms of creating a national economy that isn't obstructed by the importance of what is often called localism. So in some respects, it might be a mistake to try and identify overarching principles for the national economy as a whole, rather than focusing on what drives different types of local economic activity. But that being said, it is these overarching principles and objectives that I'm now going to turn to in the rest of the lecture. My starting point in trying to understand these overarching or underpinning principles might seem a little bit of an odd one, because it's the commercial bank law of the People's Republic of China. But I think it's a really good example of the tension in the Chinese leadership, not just the current Chinese leadership, between wanting to create a sort of market economy, but also wanting to control and direct what that market economy does. So Article 4 says that a commercial bank must operate independently on the management principles of economic efficiency, safety, and liquidity, without interference. Basically, it mandates the commercial banks to be exactly that, commercial actors, acting according to market principles. And yet, if we go a little bit further on, we find in Article 34 the instruction that a commercial bank shall conduct its loan business in accordance with the need for the development of the national economy and social progress, and under the guidance of the state industrial policy. So basically, the banks should act as commercial actors, but act in ways that support the party state's goals and ambitions. So my basic understanding goes something like this, and I should say here, because I'm influenced by the work of Susan Strange, who wrote about states and markets, I'm going to use the language of the state, even though we need to bear in mind that behind the state, in this case, is the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. So we have a market economy that is allowed to exist only if it does the things that the state wants it to do. It sets the overarching goals for what economic activity is meant to achieve. It creates boundaries, limits on the things that the market and private actors can do. As we'll see, it can and does privilege certain actors within that market economy to try and increase their leverage, their freedom of operations. Crucially, the state doesn't trust the market or private actors to do the things that it wants them to do. They need to be controlled, but also at times the state needs to step in and intervene. It has a relatively low threshold for understanding market failure. I don't mean market failure as Western liberal economists would understand it here. I mean market failure in terms of the market not doing the things that the state wants it to do. And if it thinks that it's not doing those things, then it will step in, it will intervene, and it will remove some of the freedoms that had previously been there for market and private actors. Which generates the obvious question, well, how do you do this? How do you create a market that does the things that you want it to do and only the things that you want it to do? And this is an issue that China's leaders have been grappling with for decades. Here you can see Chen Yun, one of China's key economic theorists and planners going back to the 1950s. And he was keen to see some role for market forces, but he wanted to ensure that they were controlled and constrained by the overarching goals and ambitions and power and authority of the state. And he developed what was called the Birdcage theory. The idea was that the cage was the state system, state planning, state ownership, so on and so forth. But within that, you could have a bird, the market. The problem was, how do you create a bird cage that is exactly the right size? If the cage is too tight, then the bird won't be able to flourish and will die, and you'll lose all the benefits of it. But conversely, if the bars on the cage are too wide, then the bird will fly away and you lose control and you won't be able to do anything. So what mechanisms then does the state deploy to try and control the market without killing it, without killing the bird? We've already touched on two very important mechanisms that the state has to try and control, shape, guide, direct the market and economic activity. First is finance and commercial bank law, funneling money to the right sort of actors doing the right sort of activity. And the second is local governments. I mean, they too are very important sources of funding and finance, giving out contracts, for example. But certainly starting a new business in China, you need lots of licenses and permits and things like that, lots of things signed off. And so having a good relationship with the local government and being seen to do the sort of things that local government wants you to do very much helps in getting off the ground in the first place and then winning contracts and continuing to operate in the longer term. If we return to the banks for a second, if you want to support states' objectives, you need to know what they are. And this is why planning is so important still in establishing the overall direction that the party state wants to go down so that other people can then make decisions that support those objectives. So we still have a 5-year plan, actually called an outline guidance, but that establishes the general direction of travel every, surprisingly, 5 years. We have occasional big statements, like in 2015, the Made in China 2025 blueprint for where the country should be 10 years on, really looking at technological upgrading and really an overhaul of the technological base of Chinese economic growth. The push towards a low carbon economy has been important too. And in individual parts of the country and economic sectors, we also see periodic announcement of big plans and objectives that then people like the banks and others can direct their activities to support. Ownership is important too. Over the years, we've seen quite a big decline in the number of state-owned enterprises owned by the government. As you can see, they're down from 113,000 to 72,000 in 2018. These figures are from the National Economic Censuses. There's another one taking place as I give this lecture, so by the time you're watching it, we might have the new statistics, but the overall direction of travel is clear. Interestingly, when we think of state-owned enterprises, maybe we think about the big, like the energy ones that are owned by the central government. But actually, most state-owned enterprises in China operate at the local level rather than the national level, which takes us back to an issue I've been talking about before, the importance of the local political economy. In terms of numbers, the private sector dominates. 84% of the total number of enterprises in China, private sector. However, even though there's been a decline in the number of state-owned enterprises, what they do remains significant. They control what is sometimes called the commanding heights of the economy, those economic sectors that then tend to shape the overall direction of economic development. They have monopolies in strategic sectors, what's called dominance in pillar sectors. You can see there what those are. It's also quite tricky to work out the real extent of state ownership in the economic system, because the biggest type of enterprise in China are limited liability companies. And many of these have shares that are actually owned by one or more state-owned enterprise. And if you trace back the share ownership, you often find that, in fact, the state sector has a dominant holding in what, on the face of it, looks like it's a private enterprise through their shareholdings. And a couple of things that have happened in the Xi Jinping era to really strengthen the state, or actually really the party's control. The first is that party committees have been strengthened within private enterprises. So if you've got a company and you have Communist Party members, they have to set up a party committee within that enterprise, and one of their tasks is to make sure that the party's objectives are being followed and pushed through. And also there have been a number of new legal obligations placed on private companies to do the sort of things that the state wants them to do. Here's a list of some of them. I'm not going to go into any detail. If you are interested, now would be a good time to hit pause and see some of the things that have been introduced that mandate the private sector, private actors, to do things that the state wants it to do. And the last mechanism I really want to talk about is pricing, which has actually become significantly less important over the years as the market has been allowed to set the price of most things. I mean, the state still plays a role in some key areas like water, but then again, water prices are set by the state in many countries. And there are ongoing reforms taking place, for example, in the energy market. So by the time you watch this, there might be a slightly different situation in terms of energy pricing than there is at the moment. But what I want to really focus on really is the lack of trust in the market to do the things that the state wants it to do, and this issue of a low threshold of market failure. So in the countryside, for example, there are minimum prices paid to peasants for certain goods to maintain income stability, so it's not just left to the market. The state at times steps in to buy agricultural produce and store them to sort of boost the market and boost the price of those and ensure incomes. And in times of perceived crisis or potential crisis, the state is very quick to step in to impose new price controls. And I think it does this with a large degree of support from the population. So we saw price controls in 2011 and 2015, but in 2015 only in specific sectors. But I quite like this headline from the Global Times being one of the party newspapers. China's top economic planner vows all necessary means to curb irrational coal prices. And it's this idea that the price is irrational and that the state needs to do something about this irrationality that I find interesting here. So pricing still has some role to play, though less of a role than before. So there we have different mechanisms that the state can use, does use in different ways. How does this all play out? Well, now it's time for that very complicated slide that I referred to at the beginning of the lecture. So this is what I think it ends up looking like. It is a market economy, but it's not a free market economy. It's a state-shaped, a state-guided, and at times even a state-controlled market economy. And the extent of state influence, control, guidance, pushing, prodding, whatever you want to call it, changes over time. Strategic and pillar state-owned enterprises are important in shaping the way that the market acts, and they are supported by the state's control or influence of finance and some limited price controls. But state-owned enterprises aren't just they're sitting above the market economy, as it were. They are actors in that market economy on a daily basis as well. Price controls can be at times extended in times of crisis or to deal with specific problems. The finance system is crucial in channeling money to those types of enterprise, whether state-owned or not, that are doing the sort of things that the party state wants them to do. As I've been saying from the beginning of this lecture, it's not all about the national level, local governments are very important too. And through their influence over local finance, their ability to award contracts and licenses, also their ownership of state-owned enterprises at the local government level too, they have a big significant impact on the way that the market economy operates and the different types of market economies that operate in different parts of the country. And then there is one important thing that I haven't mentioned anywhere so far in this lecture at all, and that is the importance of the state control of land. There is no private ownership of land in China. It is all owned by the local government, and that of course gives them significant ability to shape who can do what within any jurisdiction. So I think that sort of works. It's a market economy that isn't totally closed off by the state, but is shaped by it on three sides, as it were. And then to create an extra layer of complication, what I've called the national economy here is then given some protection from unwanted international global forces as well. Exchange rate policy, currency controls, monetary policy, so on and so forth. It's not closed off from the global economy, far from it, but it does have some protection, and hence the depiction of a perforated circle containing the national economy in this final substantive slide. Which just leaves me to finish off with two less important but also less complicated slides. This is my homepage at the University of Warwick. You can see some of my photographs from over the years in China if you want, and there's also copies of various papers, podcasts and things like that that you can get hold of if you so want to. And this is the publication page for the EuroHub for Sino project that I'm involved with, which has access to various policy papers and more coming every month, and they're all free to download too. So that's it. Obviously there's only so much you can do in a relatively short period of time. It's a complicated topic, and it's also a changing topic. I mean, studying moving targets is never easy, and things can move quite quickly in China, and certainly have at times in Xi Jinping's China. I hope you got something from it. Please get in touch with me if you think that there's anything you need clarifying, and good luck with the rest of your studies.